My name is Rowena Thorne, and for most of my 46 years, I have cultivated patience. As a landscape designer in the quiet, green-hemmed city of Crestwood, patience is the soil from which my entire life grows. I wait for seeds to germinate, for saplings to root, for the slow, deliberate unfurling of a fern frond. I've learned that you cannot rush beauty, nor can you force growth. You can only create the right conditions and trust in the process. This philosophy has served me well in my gardens, but with my family, it has been a lesson I've had to learn over and over again, each time with more painful thorns. My world, my true north, is my daughter, Clara. At 19, she possessed a stillness that seemed ancient, a quiet intensity that she poured not into words, but into her hands. Ever since she was a little girl, her fingers were her voice, happiest when covered in clay, charcoal dust, or the fine sawdust of reclaimed wood. Her studio, a converted sunroom at the back of our small house, was a sanctuary of her own making, smelling of damp earth, turpentine, and the sweet scent of cedar. It was there she spent 7 months creating a gift for her grandmother's 70th birthday. It wasn't just a sculpture, it was a testament. A piece she called Anchor, crafted from a gnarled piece of driftwood she'd found on a trip to the coast, combined with delicate, hand-molded ceramic forms that coiled around the wood like sea foam. It was a physical manifestation of her love for my mother, Eleonora, woman Clara saw as a pillar of strength and refined taste, a formidable but inspiring figure in her life. Clara believed, with the untainted sincerity of youth, that this piece, into which she had poured every ounce of her skill and heart, would finally earn her a specific kind of recognition, a look of genuine, unvarnished pride from the woman she admired most. The day of the party, she wrapped it with the reverence of a sacred offering, her hands trembling slightly as she tied the silk ribbon. She had also written a letter, a long, heartfelt missive on thick, creamy paper. I saw her at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration, filling the page with words of gratitude and admiration, explaining how Eleonora's exacting standards had pushed her to become a better artist. It should have been a landmark moment. It should have been cherished. My mother's 70th birthday party was exactly as one would expect, a symphony of muted colors, clinking crystal, and conversations that floated on a cloud of polite insincerity. The house, a modern architectural statement with vast windows overlooking a meticulously manicured garden, felt less like a home and more like a gallery curated to within an inch of its life. Everything was in its place, beautiful and untouchable. When Clara presented her gift, my mother accepted it with a cool, practiced grace. She unwrapped it carefully, her eyes scanning the form of Anchor with a practiced, critical gaze. She held it for a moment, turned it over in her hands, and then set it down on a side table. "How lovely, dear," she said, her voice a smooth, polished stone. "You have such a creative spirit." And that was it. No questions about the process, no exclamation over the intricate details, no hug. Just a placid smile and a swift pivot to greet another guest. I saw the flicker of disappointment in Clara's eyes, but she quickly masked it with a hopeful smile. Later, as we drove home under a canopy of stars, she turned to me, her voice small. "Do you think she really liked it?" Lovely can mean so many things. I wanted to tell her that with Eleonora, words were often just decorative placeholders, their true meaning buried under layers of aesthetic judgment. I wanted to protect her from the slow drip of conditional affection I had known my whole life. But she was so desperate to believe in the version of her grandmother she had built in her own mind. "She'll find the perfect place for it, sweetie," I said, the words feeling hollow even to me. "You know how particular she is. That means she's taking it seriously." Clara seemed to accept this, and I let the silence settle between us, a fragile truce with a truth I wasn't ready to confront. The next morning, I drove back to my mother's house to help with the post-party cleanup, a role I had long since inherited. The house was quiet, the air still faintly smelling of expensive perfume and champagne. My mother was in the living room, adjusting a small, framed picture on the wall. It was a crayon drawing by my 10-year-old nephew, Milamy's sister Sylvia's son. A cheerful, lopsided house with a giant, smiling sun. Isn't it just brimming with untutored genius? Eleonora asked, stepping back to admire her handiwork. The drawing was at perfect eye level, professionally framed under museum glass. It's very bold, I managed, the word catching in my throat. I bit back the urge to ask if Milo's genius was the reason a 7-month labor of love was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I kept my voice light. Speaking of which, where did you end up putting Clara's sculpture? I was just thinking it would look beautiful on the mantel. Eleonora waved a dismissive hand, not even turning to look at me. Oh, that. It's a bit rustic for the main living area, don't you think? The lines are complicated. I've put it away safely for now. I need to find just the right spot for it, somewhere it won't clash. A familiar cold dread began to creep up my spine, but I pushed it down. Safely. She said she'd put it somewhere safe. I nodded, forced a smile, and went to gather the trash bags from the kitchen. It was a mindless, familiar chore. I carried 2 heavy, black bags out to the side of the house where the large, municipal waste bins stood in a neat row. The air was cool and damp. I lifted the lid of the general waste bin. And my world stopped. There, nestled amongst crushed champagne bottles, soggy napkins, and the wilted remains of floral arrangements, was a familiar curve of driftwood. It was unmistakable. Anchor. It was wedged upside down. One of the delicate ceramic coils snapped clean off, smeared with what looked like coffee grounds and the greasy residue of discarded canapes. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I just stood there, the bin lid in my hand, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. It was a violation so profound, so needlessly cruel, that it felt like a physical blow. The letter, its creamy paper now stained and crumpled, was lying beside it, a casualty of the same careless desecration. I dropped the bags I was holding. My first instinct was to reach in to rescue it. But it was heavy and awkwardly positioned, buried deep beneath the party's detritus. I tugged, but it wouldn't budge. Panic, hot and sharp, pierced through my shock. I wasn't thinking about dignity or appearances or the absurdity of the situation. All I could think about was Clara's face, the hope she'd poured into this creation, now lying broken in a heap of garbage. So, I did the only thing I could. I hitched up my jeans, placed one foot on the edge of the bin for leverage, and climbed in. The stench was immediate and overwhelming, a sour mix of stale wine, rotting food, and betrayal. I ignored it. My knees sank into something soft and damp, but I didn't care. I dug with my hands, pushing aside greasy paper plates and slimy vegetable peels, my fingers finally closing around the solid, familiar form of the driftwood. I braced myself, my muscles straining, and began to lift. That's when I heard it. A giggle, followed by a shout. "Aunt Rowena? What are you doing?" I froze, turning my head. There, standing on the lawn about 20 feet away, was my nephew, Milo, his phone held up, recording. "Mom? Grandma? You have to see this. Aunt Rowena's in the trash can," he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. Before I could even form a word, before I could beg him to stop, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A small, familiar blue hatchback. Clara. My heart seized in my chest. I clutched the soiled sculpture to my body and tried to crouch down, a ridiculous, futile attempt to become invisible inside a plastic bin. She rounded the corner of the house, a small bag of pastries in her hand, a curious frown on her face. She'd probably come to have a quiet breakfast with her grandmother, to see where her sculpture had been placed. Her steps faltered when she saw me. Her eyes widened in confusion, and then they dropped to the object I was holding. The broken, dirt-streaked form of Anchor. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of sickening comprehension that washed all the color from her face. "Is that?" Her voice was a whisper, a fragile thread of sound. Did she throw it away? She already knew. I could see it in her eyes, the dawning of a devastating truth she had tried so hard to deny. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to explain, to soften the blow, but no words came. What could I say? It's not what it looks like? It was exactly what it looked like. I was a grown woman, standing in my mother's garbage, clutching the shattered pieces of my daughter's heart. Clara didn't wait for an answer. She just blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement, as if sealing a memory away. Then she turned, walked back to her car with a preternatural calm, got in, and drove away without a backward glance. And I was left alone, standing in the filth, the cold, heavy weight of her creation in my arms, and the even heavier weight of her pain settling over me like a shroud. The drive home was a blur. I placed the sculpture carefully on the passenger seat, wrapped in an old blanket I found in my trunk. I didn't stop to confront my mother. There would be a time for that, but it wasn't now. Now, all that mattered was Clara. When I arrived, her car was in the driveway, but the house was silent. I found her in her studio, standing before her empty workbench. She didn't look at me as I entered, carrying the sculpture. I gently set it down, along with the stained, crumpled letter I had rescued. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her expression unreadable. The broken ceramic, the smears of grime, the deep scratches in the wood, it was all there, an undeniable testament to its rejection. I waited for the tears, for the anger, for the storm. But it never came. Clara simply looked up at me, her eyes hollow, and asked a single question in a voice devoid of all emotion. Why? It was the most profound and unanswerable question in the universe. I could have given her a dozen reasons, a lifetime of psychological analysis of my mother's narcissism, of her inability to value anything that she couldn't claim as a reflection of her own taste. I could have talked about favoritism, about my sister Sylvia, the golden child who could do no wrong, while I, the older, responsible one, was always expected to understand, to endure, to fade into the background. I grew up in the shadow of my mother's ambitions. Eleonora had been an interior designer in her prime, celebrated in local magazines for her impeccable, if somewhat cold, aesthetic. Our home was her showroom, a place where coasters were not suggestions but laws, and human messiness was an unforgivable sin. My father, Walter, a kind but passive man, had been a successful accountant. He provided the financial canvas on which Eleonora painted her perfect life, nodding along to her pronouncements on form and function, happy to recede as long as there was peace. Then came Sylvia, 5 years my junior, a miniature version of my mother in spirit and looks. She was praised for her confidence, her flair, her effortless charm. I was praised for my quiet diligence. It was a pattern that set early and hardened into concrete. I became the caretaker, the fixer, the one who picked up the emotional and, as I grew older, the financial slack. When my father retired and their income dwindled, it was I who quietly supplemented their lifestyle, paying for vacations they couldn't afford and renovations they insisted were essential. It was never asked for directly, it was simply expected. And I, conditioned for a lifetime, never said no. I had hoped, prayed, that it would be different for Clara. Eleonora had seemed to take an interest in her artistic talent, taking her to galleries and giving her books on modernism. Clara mistook this clinical interest for genuine mentorship. She saw her grandmother's sharp critiques not as dismissals, but as challenges. "She's not being mean, Mom," she would say. "She's being honest. She holds me to a higher standard." Clara truly believed that Eleonora's approval was a prize to be earned, a summit to be conquered through sheer effort and excellence. And so she had built Anchor, a symbol of a relationship that existed only in her own hopeful heart. Standing in the studio, looking at my daughter's devastated face, none of that history mattered. An explanation would have sounded like an excuse. So I gave her the only honest answer I had. "I don't know, my love. I truly don't know." She nodded once, a tiny, jerky movement, and then walked out of the studio, her bedroom door clicking shut behind her. The sound was deafening in its finality. I was left alone with the wreckage. I spent the next hour at the studio sink, cleaning the sculpture. I worked with the same meticulous care I would give to a wounded bird. I scrubbed away the coffee grounds, gently washed the grime from the crevices of the driftwood, and collected the broken ceramic shards. It was a slow, meditative act, a silent apology, a mother's desperate attempt to mend something that had been broken on the inside. Later that evening, I went to my own garden. Under the soft glow of the porch light, I gathered materials, a gnarled oak root I'd been saving, a handful of smooth, dark river stones, a small bag of rich, black soil. I brought them into her studio and placed them on the workbench beside the cleaned, but still broken anchor. I didn't know what she would do, or if she would do anything at all. But I knew that creation was her language, and I had to give her new words. I left the studio door ajar and waited. For 2 days, there was only silence. She didn't emerge from her room, and I didn't push. I left food and tea outside her door, which were sometimes taken, sometimes not. On the 3rd morning, I heard a faint creak. I held my breath. The studio door opened, and she walked in. She stood there for a long time, just looking at the objects on the table, the broken sculpture, the root, the stones, the soil. Then, slowly, she picked up a hammer. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed through the house. It wasn't a sound of rage, but of deliberate deconstruction. For the rest of the day, and long into the night, sounds drifted from the studio, the splintering of wood, the scrape of metal on stone, the soft whisper of a brush on canvas. I didn't interrupt. I just let her work, trusting in the process. When I finally peeked in the next afternoon, the transformation was staggering. She hadn't repaired Anchor, she had annihilated it and resurrected it into something entirely new. The driftwood was now charred in places, its smooth surface brutalized. The ceramic shards were embedded in a new form, held together with a dark, gritty mixture that looked like soil and resin. She had incorporated the oak root, which now clawed its way through the center of the piece. And in the heart of it all, she had embedded a small, digital screen. On a continuous, silent loop, it played the shaky video Milo had taken, me, her mother, half submerged in a trash bin, my face strained with effort, pulling her art from the filth. My breath caught in my throat. "Clara, where did you get that?" "Milo sent it to the family group chat," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. She didn't look up from her work. "He thought it was hilarious." Sylvia replied with a laughing emoji. The casual cruelty of it landed like a punch to the gut. She had taken their mockery, their casual disregard, and made it the centerpiece of her pain. She had even shredded the recovered letter and woven the fragments into the sculpture's surface. I could just make out phrases, "Admiration for you, thank you for inspiring my heart in this." She had given the piece a new name, written on a small placard at its base, what was left. I looked at her, at this raw, brutal, and breathtakingly honest creation. This was not a piece of art born from admiration anymore. It was born from truth. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we could not let this truth be silenced. "We're not going to hide this," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "We're going to show it." Clara finally looked at me, her eyes dark with exhaustion and a flicker of fear. "Show it where?" It's too personal." "Art is supposed to be personal," I replied. "The most important art always is." That afternoon, I called Simon Doyle. He was an old friend who ran a small, highly respected gallery downtown called the Annex. It wasn't a commercial powerhouse, but a place known for championing difficult, honest work. I didn't tell him the whole story over the phone, just that my daughter had created something he needed to see. He came to the studio the next day. He was a tall, thoughtful man with kind eyes who rarely spoke unless he had something to say. He walked around what was left twice, his gaze taking in every detail: the charred wood, the shattered ceramic, the looping video, the fragmented words of the letter. He stood in front of it for a full 5 minutes in complete silence. Clara and I stood by, holding our breath. Finally, he turned to Clara. "There is more truth in this one piece," he said, his voice soft, "than in half the galleries in this city. It's painful, and it's beautiful. I have a group show opening in 3 weeks. It's called Echoes. This belongs in it." Clara just stared at him, stunned into silence. When he left, she turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What just happened?" I put my arm around her thin shoulders. You told the truth, I said. And someone finally listened. The opening night of the Echoes exhibition was a blur of muted lighting, quiet conversations, and the low hum of a captivated audience. The annex was packed. And they weren't just looking at Clara's sculpture, they were experiencing it. People stood before what was left, their faces etched with a profound, shared empathy. They watched the video of me in the bin, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock to a deep, resonant sadness. They leaned in close to read the fragmented words of the letter, piecing together the story of love and rejection. I saw a woman discreetly wipe a tear from her eye. I heard a man whisper to his companion, "My God, I feel that in my gut." By the end of the evening, a well-known local collector, a serious woman with an eye for emerging talent, approached Clara. She didn't gush. She simply looked Clara in the eye and said, "I have never been so moved by a piece of art. I would like to acquire it. My offer is $8,500. Clara looked at the woman, then at me, her expression a cocktail of shock and validation. It wasn't about the money. It was about the number as a symbol that what her grandmother had deemed worthless, the world saw as valuable. "What do I do?" she whispered to me when the collector had moved away to give her space. "You thank her," I said gently. "And you tell her you need time to think." This isn't the end of the story. Word of the piece spread through Crestwood's art community like wildfire. An influential art blogger wrote a piece titled, "The Art of Being Thrown Away," detailing the raw, emotional power of what was left. Photos of the sculpture, with the silent video playing in its heart, began circulating online. Someone took a screenshot of the blog post and shared it on a community Facebook page. From there, it didn't take long for the story to become untethered from the art world and enter the realm of local gossip. Names were never mentioned, but in a city as interconnected as Crestwood, they didn't need to be. The anonymous narrative was clear. A celebrated local tastemaker, a doyen of design, had callously discarded her granddaughter's heartfelt gift. Her daughter had rescued it from the trash. And now, that same piece was the talk of the town, hailed as a masterpiece of emotional honesty. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning. My mother and father appeared on my doorstep unannounced. Eleonora's face was a mask of cold fury. Walter hovered behind her, looking deeply uncomfortable. I let them stand on the porch for a moment before opening the door. "You need to make this stop," Eleonora said, storming past me into the living room. She threw a copy of the Local Arts Weekly on my coffee table. A photo of what was left was on the cover. "Good morning to you too, Mother." "They're calling me a monster," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "My friends are calling, asking if the stories are true." Sylvia is beside herself. "You have allowed this private family matter to become a public spectacle." "It became a public spectacle when you threw my daughter's soul into a garbage bin," I said, my voice dangerously calm. All the years of cultivated patience, of swallowing my own feelings for the sake of peace, had finally evaporated. "Rowena, please," my father interjected, his voice pleading. "Your mother, we've been under a lot of strain. The memberships, the club dues, we can't afford this kind of reputational damage." I finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a peacemaker but an enabler. "You mean she can't afford it?" Eleonora's eyes flashed. "You will tell that gallery to remove the piece. And you and Clara will issue a statement. You will say it was all a misunderstanding. An artistic experiment that we conceived of together to explore the concept of rejection." The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. She wasn't just asking me to lie, she was trying to co-opt Clara's pain and rebrand it as her own intellectual exercise. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. "No." "What did you say?" "No," I repeated, the word feeling solid and powerful in my mouth. "We will not be doing that." "You threw her work away because you didn't value it. You threw her love away because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough for you. Those are the consequences of your actions. Not mine." "So you're punishing me?" she spat. "No, Mother. I'm finally protecting my daughter. And myself." I looked from her face to my father's. "The financial support I've been providing you is also ending. Effective immediately." Walter paled. Rowena, you can't. The mortgage. That is no longer my problem to solve, I said, my voice even. You have a daughter who agrees with you. Perhaps Sylvia can help. I walked to the door and held it open. I think it's time for you to leave. Eleonora stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, utterly speechless for the first time in her life. Then, with a look of pure venom, she turned and walked out. My father gave me one last, desperate look before following her. As I closed the door, I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I felt a profound, aching sense of relief, as if a weight I had been carrying my entire life had finally been lifted. I felt free. The aftermath was both swift and brutal. We turned down the initial offer for the sculpture. 2 weeks later, it sold to a private collector from out of state for $50,000. The story, now with a stunning price tag attached, went viral. It was picked up by national art blogs. Then came the legal notices. The first was from my sister, Sylvia, on behalf of her son, Milo. Her lawyer claimed that since Milo filmed the video, he was the creator of a key component of the artwork and was thus entitled to 30% of the proceeds as a copyright holder. The letter was filled with sanctimonious drivel about protecting a minor's creative contributions. The second letter, arriving a day later, was from my mother. She claimed that, as the sculpture was a direct response to her actions and their shared relationship, she was an essential catalyst and therefore a conceptual co-creator of the piece. She was demanding 50% ownership. It was the most narcissistic legal argument I had ever seen. They hadn't just tried to destroy Clara's creation, now they were trying to profit from its ashes. The court proceedings were, thankfully, brief. The judge took one look at the fact that Milo had publicly posted the unwatermarked video to a group chat with the caption, "LOL, my aunt is a garbage person," and dismissed Sylvia's claim under the doctrine of fair use. He called Clara's work a clear example of transformative art. He was even more dismissive of my mother's claim. He looked at Eleonora over the rim of his glasses and asked, "Ma'am, are you arguing that your act of discarding your granddaughter's gift was, in fact, a creative act for which you should be compensated?" When she tried to launch into her speech about being a catalyst, he cut her off. Inspiration is not a copyrightable offense, and emotional distress is not a creative collaboration. Case dismissed. The rulings were a final, public vindication. The story hit the blogs again, this time with a legal coda, the grandmother who tried to copyright disapproval. We never heard from them again. The silence was absolute. Through the grapevine, I heard they sold the large, modern house and moved to a smaller condo in a neighboring state. Someone mentioned seeing Eleonora working at the gift shop of a small museum, folding postcards of famous artworks. It's been 3 years. Clara graduated from art school with honors and is now a full-time artist. She has her own studio, a waiting list for commissions, and a quiet, steady confidence that blooms from her like a night-blooming jasmine. The fire of her experience didn't consume her, it forged her. She creates pieces of profound beauty now, infused with a strength and wisdom that is all her own. I still live in my small house in Crestwood, still tend to my gardens. I still believe in patience, but I've learned that it isn't a passive act. It doesn't mean waiting indefinitely for people to change. It means tending to your own garden, nurturing what is precious, and having the strength to pull the weeds, no matter how long they've been growing there. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, I watch Clara in her studio, her hands moving with fluid grace over a new piece of clay, a real, easy smile on her face. In those moments, I think about the cost of this piece. We had to lose a family to find ourselves. And I wonder, every day, if that was a price too high, or the only price that could ever be paid for a daughter's soul.